get ready, because we're about to unpack a really major shift in trade policy, a specific, powerful economic intervention that has sent, genuine ripples across the U.S. economy, especially for smaller businesses. We're talking about the imposition of a sweeping, kind of unprecedented 50% tariff on copper imports, announced back in July 2025. Just think about that number for a second. 50%. This isn't, your typical 10% or even 25% like we saw with steel or aluminum duties before. No, this is really a whole new level for a commodity-specific trade measure. So today, on the deep dive, our mission is really to give you a crucial shortcut to understanding not just what this tariff is, but why it matters so deeply. We're here to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge, helping you grasp how this policy designed, ostensibly to bolster domestic production and maybe diminish reliance on foreign copper, is actually reshaping the operational stability and the competitiveness of countless American small businesses.
Yeah.
And the immediate impact was pretty much instantaneous.
Oh, absolutely.
Within just 24 hours of that July 8th announcement, COMEX copper futures surged. We're talking an astonishing 12 to 17%, leading to an unprecedented 25% premium for New York prices over their London Metal Exchange, the LME equivalent.
Yeah, that gap is critical.
So this isn't just theory, right? It's substantial market disruption and cost inflation that's already here on the ground affecting businesses right now. Okay, so we've seen the immediate market shock, but why this aggressive move? What's the strategic thinking behind a tariff this high?
It's certainly a bold vision. The stated objectives are quite clear, actually. They're talking about rebuilding domestic industrial supply chains, compelling companies to source materials domestically.
Right, bring it home.
Exactly. And countering foreign market dominance, particularly China's substantial refining capacity, which remarkably controls over 50% of global smelting.
Wow, 50%.
Yeah. So ultimately, the goal is to ensure a reliable, secure, and resilient domestic copper supply chain for national security, essentially.
Yeah.
It's framed as a long-term play for strategic independence.
It sounds almost ideal on paper, doesn't it? Rebuild, secure, reduce reliance. But is the U.S. actually ready to handle that kind of immediate domestic demand switch?
That's where we hit a critical policy gap, a really significant one. While the tariff aims for long-term domestic self-sufficiency, our immediate reality is, quite different.
How so?
The U.S. currently possesses very limited primary copper processing capacity. We have only 2 primary copper smelters, just 2.
Only 2.
And our refining capacity significantly lags behind global competitors. Plus, let's not forget, developing new domestic mines faces notoriously long permitting timelines. We're talking decades, often.
Decades, yeah.
So for American small businesses, the immediate impact of higher import costs is felt acutely right now. Without the immediate significant relief of increased domestic supply, they're kind of caught in that gap.
And you can really see that stark dislocation if you look at the price trends you mentioned. Before the announcement, say July 7th, 2025, COMEX was around $9,450 a ton.
Right.
Just 2 days later, July 9th, it hits $9,850. And then it peaked at $12,330 per metric ton.
That's the spike.
And that created that astounding 25% premium over LME prices, which were around $9,585 per metric ton. That's a massive signal of disruption, a real dislocation between the U.S. domestic market and the global one.
And what's fascinating here is how much of this divergence seems attributable to traders, front-running the tariffs.
Anticipating it.
Exactly. They started shipping record volumes of copper to the U.S. before the tariff hit, anticipating higher prices. This led to a notable increase in COMEX warehouse stocks, while LME stocks actually declined at the same time.
Interesting.
So this raises an important question, doesn't it? Is this tariff simply a tax to be absorbed, passed along? Or is it an active policy lever designed to force fundamental shifts in sourcing?
And the market reaction suggests.
It strongly suggests the latter is meant to change behavior, not just raise revenue.
And crucially, copper isn't just any commodity, is it? It's been explicitly designated as a critical material by the U.S. Department of Energy.
That's a very important designation.
Yeah, this seems to amplify the tariff's significance. It signals a national security imperative that maybe transcends typical economic protectionism.
Right.
So for you, trying to make sense of this, it implies the tariff is unlikely to be a temporary measure or easily reversed, which means businesses relying on copper need to think long-term adjustments.
Okay, so why copper? Why all this focus? What makes it so utterly indispensable?
Well, it's truly foundational in our economy. copper stands as the third most consumed material in the U.S., right after iron and aluminum.
Okay.
And what makes it so unique and frankly desirable are its properties.
Yeah.
Exceptional ductility, malleability, superior thermal and electrical conductivity, plus it has inherent corrosion resistance.
So it just does things other metals can't,
Yeah.
or not as well, pretty much. These qualities make it irreplaceable in so many applications.
And we really do rely on it for, well, almost everything, it feels like. Building construction, for instance.
That's the biggest single user. It accounts for a substantial 42 to 46% of total U.S. copper usage.
Almost half. Wow.
Then electrical and electronic products take another, say, 21 to 23%, and transportation equipment uses somewhere between 16 and 19%.
So those three sectors cover the vast majority.
They do. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, global demand for copper is just escalating dramatically, partly due to the accelerating energy transition.
Like EVs and renewables.
Exactly. Think about electric vehicles, renewable energy infrastructure like solar panels and wind turbines,
Yeah,
and also the burgeoning need for AI data centers.
right. Data centers are huge energy users.
They are. And what's critical to understand is that all of these EVs, renewables, data centers, are significantly more copper intensive than their traditional counterparts. This is driving demand through the roof globally.
So here's the reality check then. The U.S. copper market's supply-demand dynamics. We're the world's second largest consumer of copper.
Big appetite.
But we currently produce only just over half of the refined copper we consume each year.
Right. That leaves a big gap.
It does. It means a net import reliance of about 45% in 2024. And where do we get it from? Over 90% of U.S. refined copper imports last year originated from just 3 countries.
Let me guess. Chile.
Chile is number 1, accounting for 55 to 64%. Then Canada with 18 to 28%, and Peru.
Okay, so heavily concentrated.
Very. Which naturally creates a major source of uncertainty with this new tariff. A huge concern in the market is whether these key supplier countries, especially those with existing free trade agreements like Chile and Canada, will be granted exemptions from this 50% tariff.
That's the multi-billion-dollar question right now.
Yeah.
Consider Chile, where copper contributes a substantial 20% to its GDP. 20%.
That's massive for their economy.
It is. And analyses suggest a full 50% tariff could reduce Chilean copper exports to the U.S. by up to 30%. That's a significant economic hit for them, and it really underscores the broad international impact of this U.S. policy.
And it highlights a huge vulnerability for us, too, given our limited domestic processing that you mentioned earlier.
Exactly.
Just 2 primary copper smelters currently operating in the U.S. It contrasts so sharply with China, the world's largest copper refiner, controlling over 50% of global smelting capacity. That's a massive strategic gap we're apparently trying to bridge here.
It is, but there's another piece to this puzzle, which is secondary copper. The stuff derived from recycling scrap materials.
Recycling, right.
Globally, it's the fastest growing segment of copper supply. And the U.S. possesses this vast urban mine, an estimated 86 million tons of copper, already in use within our infrastructure and products, just sitting there, in wires, pipes, electronics.
86 million tons. That's incredible.
It is. But despite this huge resource, we predominantly export our copper scrap. Around half of the 1.5, almost 1.6 million tons generated in 2022 was sent overseas.
Why do we do that if we need copper?
Well, historically, it's been due to a lack of sufficient domestic secondary copper smelters, specifically ones capable of processing the more complex scrap grades efficiently.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting and maybe potentially game-changing, right?
Go on.
This 50% tariff, by making imported primary copper prohibitively expensive, suddenly creates this powerful economic incentive. It makes domestic secondary copper that recycled scrap significantly more attractive and competitive.
Exactly. It changes the entire calculation.
It's like suddenly making the gold panned from your local stream more valuable than imported gold bars.
That's a good analogy.
So this could actually trigger a substantial reshoring of copper recycling and processing activities, bringing that value back home.
That's the potential upside. Enhancing U.S. supply chain resilience and contributing to long-term environmental sustainability through better recycling. It's a forced shift, yes, but one with potentially profound positive consequences down the line.
Now, let's talk about the direct ripple effect on American small businesses, because this is really where the policy hits home for so many people listening.
It absolutely does. Just think about it. Raw material costs often make up a huge chunk of a small manufacturer's income. On average, about 42% of annual revenue for manufacturing sole proprietorships.
42%, okay.
Now, imagine a critical input like copper suddenly costing 50% more overnight. That's not just eroding profit margins, which already average a modest 8% for many manufacturing businesses.
8% isn't much wiggle room.
Not at all. It's a direct threat to their viability, their ability to even stay open.
You're right. It means dramatic inflation of overall production costs. We're seeing projections that sectors heavily reliant on copper are facing significant material cost increases. Construction, maybe 3–5%. Electronics, maybe 6–8%.
Fair.
Even higher there.
And transportation, maybe 2–4% increase.
Those are the kinds of numbers industry analysts are talking about.
And these aren't abstract numbers. They directly eat into what little profit margin many small businesses have to survive on.
And this really highlights the disproportionate impact on small businesses, doesn't it? They typically operate on significantly narrower profit margins compared to large corporations.
Right. Less cushion.
Exactly. They have far less negotiating leverage with suppliers and simply fewer resources, less cash, less access to credit to absorb sudden, drastic cost increases like this.
Is there data on that?
There is. Data indicates that small enterprises in copper-related manufacturing were already facing severe constraints before the tariff, operating at just 62.58% capacity utilization.
Wow, that's low.
It is. That's an 8 percentage point gap compared to large operations. So they're already struggling, and this tariff just compounds the pressure immensely.
And beyond the direct financial hit, I imagine there are significant operational and supply chain disruptions too. Oh, definitely. Tariffs, just by their nature, complicate and slow down sourcing and customs processes. That leads to delays, which directly impact production schedules, shipping schedules.
Knock-on effects everywhere.
Precisely. And this exacerbates pre-existing vulnerabilities we already saw in global copper supply chains from, geopolitical events, logistical bottlenecks from the last few years.
It's piling on.
And the tariff also forces businesses to scramble. They have to switch suppliers or try to renegotiate existing terms. That process demands significant additional time, resources, and often capital investment they might not have. Imagine the chaos for a small shop owner.
Yeah, absolutely. So who exactly is feeling the most heat from this? Let's maybe zoom in on some sector-specific impacts so you can get a clearer sense of how this plays out in different parts of the economy.
Good idea.
First, let's take building construction. You said this is the single largest market for copper in the U.S., right? 46% of consumption.
That's correct. The giant share.
Okay, now here's the crucial part for small businesses. Nearly 100%, like 99.94% of all construction companies are classified as small businesses.
It's dominated by small firms.
And get this, 68%, over 2/3, employ fewer than 5 individuals.
Wow. Tiny operations.
Tiny operations, which makes the sector incredibly sensitive to copper price fluctuations. We mentioned that estimated material cost increase of 3–5%.
Which is significant when margins are thin.
Exactly. And copper is absolutely indispensable for them, right? Pipework, plumbing, heating, roofing, and all forms of electrical wiring. Just building wire alone consumes something like 20% of the total U.S. copper supply.
Critical input.
So when copper prices jump like this, almost every construction bid, every project estimate has to be reevaluated. It throws everything into uncertainty. Okay, next sector. Electrical and electronic manufacturing. This accounts for a significant 21–23% of U.S. copper usage.
Still a very big piece.
And guess what? Again, small manufacturing firms dominate here too, collectively representing a whopping 98% of all manufacturing firms in the U.S.
So again, the small guys are the majority.
Yeah. And copper is absolutely crucial for things like semiconductors. The burgeoning infrastructure of data centers, which you mentioned, are incredibly copper intensive, needing tons of it for power infrastructure.
27 tons per megawatt is one figure cited.
Huge amount. Plus electric vehicles, renewable energy applications. Here, the estimated cost increase is even higher, potentially 6–8%.
That's a serious hit for electronics manufacturers.
Definitely. And finally, let's touch on transportation equipment manufacturing. This sector utilizes 16–19% of the total U.S. copper supply.
Still substantial.
And the shift towards EVs is a major driver here, as we discussed. Electric vehicles require, 4 times more copper than traditional gas-powered cars?
Roughly, yes. The figures often cited are around 73 kilograms in a battery electric vehicle compared to maybe 30 kilograms in an internal combustion engine vehicle.
Okay, so the estimated cost increase for copper-intensive components, things like wiring harnesses, is around 2–4% for this sector. Automakers are already grappling with these costs, and analysts suggest they're inevitably passing them on to consumers. We're hearing New vehicle prices could potentially rise by at least $3,000,
Yeah, that cost has to go somewhere.
which is a direct hit to your wallet if you're buying a new car.
Absolutely. And, this whole situation forces small manufacturers, especially, into a really brutal choice.
What's that?
Either accept orders at what might be unsustainable profit margins just to keep work flowing, or further reduce production, cut back shifts, maybe lay people off.
Neither sounds good for long-term health.
Not at all. It directly threatens their long-term viability and competitiveness. However, there's another angle emerging more strongly now: material substitution.
Using something else instead of copper.
Exactly. Aluminum, for example, is repeatedly cited as a common substitute for electrical and heat conductivity applications. It offers about 60% of copper's conductivity, but it's lighter and, crucially, cheaper.
Okay, what else?
Plastics like PEX and CPVC are increasingly viable for plumbing applications, replacing copper pipes.
Right, I've seen those.
So this steep 50% tariff, by drastically altering the cost-benefit analysis of using copper, will inevitably accelerate the adoption of material substitution in areas where it was maybe previously considered marginal or too difficult.
So it's forcing innovation, or at least faster adoption of alternative.
It is. It's a radical shift in how businesses decide what materials to even use in their products. A fundamental recalculation.
So if you're out there listening, maybe running a small business, navigating this incredibly challenging landscape, what can you actually do? What adaptive strategies are essential right now?
Yeah, that's the key question. Proactive and adaptive strategies are absolutely critical for survival. The first one has to be aggressive supply chain diversification.
Meaning don't rely on just one source.
Exactly. Businesses should immediately identify and start cultivating relationships with multiple suppliers. Focus heavily on domestic options if possible, and also near-shoring options. Think Mexico or Canada benefiting from USMCA.
Are there specific places to look domestically?
Sure. There are established domestic metal distributors like Industrial Metal Supply, IMS, Metal Associates, Hillman Brass and Copper, Reliance. Many offer custom cutting, next-day local delivery. Plus, online marketplaces like ThomasNet or metals-hub.com can help connect buyers and sellers. The bottom line is, you just can't afford to have all your eggs in one supplier basket anymore.
Makes sense. And what about managing the costs you can't avoid through diversification?
Well, that leads directly to rigorous cost management and operational efficiency. It sounds basic, but it's crucial now. This means adopting a really lean mindset.
How so?
Meticulously analyze and reduce unnecessary purchases. Eliminate waste wherever possible in your processes, and maybe strategically invest in more efficient machinery if the payback makes sense now.
And the material substitution you mentioned.
Yes. Part of cost management is thoroughly evaluating the technical and economic feasibility of material substitution. Really digging into alternatives like aluminum, plastics, maybe even emerging composites where they make sense for your product and quality standards. It's about squeezing every single bit of efficiency out of your operations.
Okay, diversification, efficiency. But sometimes you just have to pass on increased costs, right? How do you handle that, especially with long-term contracts or valued customers?
That's where proactive pricing and contractual adjustments come in. It's tough, but necessary. We recommend businesses look at incorporating clear price escalation clauses into their contracts, especially for longer-term projects.
So the contract allows for price changes if materials go up.
Precisely. It builds in flexibility. Dynamic pricing models where prices adjust more frequently based on input costs can also be very effective, though maybe harder to implement for some.
And communication is key, I imagine.
Absolutely crucial. Transparent and consistent communication with your customers regarding any price adjustments is paramount. You need to maintain trust and manage expectations. Nobody likes a surprise bill, especially a much higher one.
Definitely not. Now, are there any lifelines, any support systems businesses can tap into?
Yes, and this is often overlooked. Leveraging government support and advisory services is key. People should specifically look into programs like the Trade Adjustment Assistance for Firms program, TAF.
TAF.
TAF. It exists specifically to help U.S. manufacturing firms hurt by import competition. They offer technical assistance, cost sharing for improvement projects. It's designed for situations exactly like this.
Good to know, so check out TAF.
Definitely. And finally, stepping back a bit, strategic planning for long-term resilience. Given copper's critical material designation, this tariff isn't likely just a blip. It feels like a long-term policy signal from the government.
So businesses need to plan accordingly.
Exactly. Develop flexible what-if scenarios. Think about cash flow planning, capital investments under conditions of sustained higher input costs. Prepare for potential ongoing shifts in market dynamics. This long-term view is really essential now for adapting business models, maybe fostering a more robust, domestically oriented operational framework over time. It's about building a business that can withstand future shocks, not just this one.
Okay, so to quickly recap our deep dive for you today, we've covered the unprecedented nature of this 50% copper tariff, its immediate and pretty stark market disruption, and the disproportionate, truly brutal impact it's having on American small businesses in those copper-intensive sectors like construction, electronics, and transportation.
Yeah, the pain is real there.
We've also highlighted the essential strategic responses required for, well, survival and hopefully resilience. Things like diversifying supply chains, managing costs, exploring substitution, and planning for the long haul.
Key survival tactics.
It really seems this tariff is acting as a powerful catalyst, forcing fundamental reevaluations of supply chain strategies, driving a renewed focus on domestic sourcing and that potential reshoring of recycling we talked about, and definitely accelerating the exploration of material substitution.
It's shaking things up, no question.
Our goal today was really to transform what can feel like information overload into some actionable insights for you. We hope this deep dive has provided a clearer, concise, and comprehensive understanding of this really complex economic issue. Now, just to leave you with a thought to mull over, how might this aggressive U.S. tariff on a critical material like copper trigger a broader global shift?
Interesting question.
Could it prompt other major economies, Europe, maybe others in Asia, to implement similar protectionist measures for their own strategic materials? Or maybe invest heavily in their own domestic supply chain resilience?
Sort of domino effect.
Yeah. What surprising innovations or maybe even unexpected partnerships might emerge as a result of these forces? Something to think about.